Imagine walking alone in a dimly lit hospital hallway at 3 a.m., the only sound being the faint hum of fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The air is sterile, yet heavy with something unseen. Now imagine catching a glimpse of movement in the corner of your eye, something that shouldn't be there. Now imagine realizing it's watching you. Sarah had been a night shift nurse at St. Mary's Hospital for 3 years. She loved the quiet, the stillness of the late hours, the way the world outside seemed to pause while she carried out her rounds. But St. Mary's was old, its history stretching back over a century, and with age came whispers, stories passed down from one shift to the next. Some were silly superstitions, the kind used to spook new employees. Others, however, had an eerie consistency, retold with too much detail, too much certainty. It was on one of these nights, in the depths of early morning, when Sarah first encountered something that would shake her to her core. The hospital was unusually empty, only a handful of patients in the ward, their machines beeping in rhythmic intervals. She had just finished checking on Mr. Thompson in room 215 when she saw it, a soft, rhythmic blinking down the hall, the call light for room 237. Her heart stilled. That room had been unoccupied for weeks, ever since the last patient, an elderly woman with dementia, had passed away. Maintenance hadn't even bothered to make up the bed yet the light was blinking. Sarah hesitated. The rational part of her mind told her it was just a malfunction, a glitch in the system. But another part, an instinct buried deep in her gut, told her to turn around and pretend she never saw it. She exhaled slowly, shaking off the unease, and made her way down the hall. The closer she got, the more the temperature seemed to drop. By the time she reached the door, she could see her own breath. She hesitated only a second before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the only illumination coming from the faint blue glow of the call button above the bed. A chill ran down her spine. The air smelled different, not the usual mix of disinfectant and sterile linens, but something metallic, thick, clinging to the back of her throat. Blood. Sarah swallowed hard and reached for the call button, switching it off. The moment she did, the air seemed to shift, like a silent breath exhaled from the walls themselves. She turned quickly, ready to leave, but as she stepped into the hallway, she heard it. A sound so faint at first that she thought she imagined it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Behind her. Her pulse quickened as she turned her head slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Then, the footsteps quickened. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The corridor was empty, but the sound was still there, growing louder, closer. She took a step back, another step. Then she felt it. A breath, cold and damp, right against the nape of her neck. Every muscle in her body seized as she turned, expecting to find someone, anyone, standing behind her. But there was nothing. And then she saw it. A shadow, not cast by the flickering lights above, not attached to any figure or form. It was just there, a pitch-black void, darker than the rest of the hallway, shifting, twisting, watching. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow stretched, elongated, growing taller, closer. Then from within its shifting form something emerged. A face, or what should have been a face. Hollow eyes, empty sockets, a mouth that barely moved as it whispered, "You shouldn't have turned it off." Sarah stumbled backward, her vision swimming. The next thing she knew, she was running, sprinting down the hallway, her footsteps pounding against the cold tile. She didn't stop until she was at the nurse's station, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She forced herself to look back. The hallway was empty. The call light in room 237 was off. The next morning, she tried to brush it off. Maybe exhaustion had played tricks on her mind. Maybe it was just another one of those stories. Except she had lived it. But as she sat at the nurse's station, scrolling through the hospital's digital logs, her blood ran cold. Room 237. A patient had died there, decades ago. An elderly man, admitted for heart failure. One night his condition worsened. He pressed the call button for help, but it was a busy night. The nurses had been overwhelmed. No one came. By the time they found him, his hand was still clutching the call button. The last words he ever spoke? "Why didn't anyone come?" Sarah slammed the laptop shut. Her hands were shaking, but something was gnawing at her, an itch in the back of her mind she couldn't shake. She needed to know more. That night, after her shift, she dug into old hospital records. It wasn't just one patient. Several patients over the decades had reported strange occurrences in that room. Patients waking up gasping for air, claiming something was sitting on their chest. Nurses reporting shadows that shouldn't exist. And then she found something worse. A report from 1952. A nurse much like Sarah who had seen the call light blinking in 237. She had gone in, turned it off, and vanished. Her body was never found, only her shoes, neatly placed outside the room as if she had stepped out of them and disappeared. Sarah's stomach turned. The shadow had spoken to her. A warning? A threat? Was she next? That night, when she returned. For her shift, she made her usual rounds. But this time she wasn't alone. Every time she turned a corner, she felt eyes watching her. Every time she blinked, she swore the shadows moved. At exactly 3 a.m., the call light for room 237 blinked. On this time, Sarah didn't move. She didn't go down the hall. She didn't open the door. She just watched. And from the darkness beyond the doorway, the shadow watched back. Then, the door creaked open, on its own. Sarah's breath hitched. The darkness inside seemed to pulse, beckoning her forward. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Why didn't anyone come? A force tugged at her, pulling her toward the room. Her fingers dug into the wall, resisting. She was slipping, her feet dragging against the tile. A final, desperate scream tore from her throat. Then suddenly everything went still. She was on the floor. The room was silent. The call light was off. Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran. She never worked another night shift again. But the next nurse who took her place, she wasn't so lucky, because at 3 a.m. the call light for room 237 blinked on once more, and this time, someone answered. What would you do if you were alone in a deserted truck stop at midnight and a trucker who shouldn't exist pulled in asking for help? Would you trust your instincts, or would you regret looking into his hollow, pleading eyes? Mark had worked as a security guard at the old truck stop off Interstate 80 for nearly 5 years. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. His shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., patrolling the near-abandoned lot, making sure no one loitered too long, and keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. Most nights were quiet, too quiet. The truck stop, once a thriving rest stop for long-haul drivers, had fallen into near disuse after a newer, more modern rest area was built a few miles down the road. Now, only the occasional desperate traveler stopped by, and even they never stayed long. It was just after midnight when Mark first heard it, the low, guttural rumble of an approaching semi-truck. He squinted into the thick fog that had rolled in over the lot, shrouding everything in eerie silence. The beams of 2 headlights cut through the mist like spectral eyes, growing larger as the truck pulled in, slow and deliberate. Something felt off. Mark had seen hundreds of trucks come and go, but there was something unsettling about this one. It was old, older than most semis still on the road. Its paint faded, the chrome dulled by time and the elements. The engine sounded strange, not just loud, but almost strained, as if the vehicle itself was fighting to stay running. The truck came to a halt near the gas pumps, idling noisily. Mark watched as the driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. The driver was tall and thin, his face pale, almost sickly under the flickering fluorescent lights. His eyes were sunken, shadowed like he hadn't slept in years. He walked, with a strange stiffness, as though his joints didn't quite move the way they should. When he reached Mark, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I need help," he rasped. "My brakes, they're not working." Mark hesitated. There was something unnatural about the man's voice, like it was struggling to hold on to something that wasn't entirely there. But he forced a polite nod. "I can call the mechanic on duty," he offered. "We've got one just a few minutes away." The driver gave a slow, almost mechanical nod. "Appreciate it," he murmured, before turning back toward his truck. Mark radioed for the mechanic, Joe, an old-timer who had been working at the stop for longer than anyone. Within 10 minutes, Joe arrived, his toolbox rattling as he approached the semi. He gave Mark a nod and crouched near the front axle, flashlight in hand. Joe's inspection didn't take long. After a few minutes, he stood up, his brow furrowed. "Nothing wrong with the brakes," he said, wiping his hands on his grease-stained coveralls. "Everything looks fine." Mark turned back to tell the driver, but he was gone, not walking away, not heading toward the truck stop's diner or restroom, just gone. A chill crawled down Mark's spine. He turned back toward the truck, expecting to see the cab door open, maybe a figure climbing inside. But the truck was completely still, its idling engine the only sign of life. Where the hell did he go? Joe muttered, echoing Mark's thoughts. They checked inside the diner. Empty. The restrooms, no sign of him. Even the surveillance cameras captured nothing. One moment, he was standing beside Mark, and the next, he had vanished into thin air. Unease settled in Mark's stomach. Something wasn't right. Hours passed, and the fog thickened outside. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the mist. He found himself glancing toward the truck more often than he liked, half expecting to see the driver return, but no one came. Then, around 3:15 a.m., the silence was shattered by the sound of screeching tires. Mark's blood ran cold. The sound was unmistakable. Rubber burning against asphalt, the desperate cry of a vehicle losing control. Then came the impact. A deafening crash, metal twisting, glass shattering. The ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Mark bolted outside, heart hammering. The semi-truck was gone from the lot. But 50 yards away, on the stretch of highway just beyond the truck stop's perimeter, it lay overturned, cab crushed beneath its own weight, smoke rising in eerie tendrils into the night air. Mark ran toward the wreckage. Joe was already there, shouting into his radio for emergency services. The scene was horrifying. The front of the truck caved in, the windshield spiderwebbed with fractures. But as Mark peered inside, a different horror took hold. There was no driver, no blood, no body, no sign that anyone had ever been behind the wheel. Mark took a shaky step back. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. That truck had pulled into the lot. He had spoken to the driver. He had seen him, hadn't he? Then Joe called out, "Mark, you need to see this." Mark followed Joe's pointing finger to the ground beside the wreckage. There, half buried in the dirt and scattered debris, lay an old logbook. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. But as Mark flipped it open, the entries were eerily clear. The last date, October 12, 2003, 20 years ago to the day. The final entry, scrawled in desperate, shaky handwriting, "Brakes failing, can't stop. If anyone finds this, tell my wife I'm sorry." Mark's breath hitched. He turned the page, fingers trembling. There, clipped to the back cover, was an old, faded photograph. It was a man, tall, thin, gaunt face, sunken eyes. The same man Mark had spoken to just hours before. His name was written on the back in smudged ink, David Reynolds. A chill ran through Mark's entire body. He had heard the name before. Everyone at the truck stop had. David Reynolds was the trucker who had died 2 decades earlier in a fatal accident just outside the stop. His brakes had failed as he tried to pull into the lot, and he had swerved to avoid hitting another vehicle. He hadn't survived the crash, and yet his truck had returned tonight. His voice had whispered through the lot, still pleading for help that had come too late. Mark looked up at the wreckage one last time. The headlights had gone dark, the truck now lifeless, nothing more than twisted metal and broken glass. But deep in the fog, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, Mark thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the road, watching. Then, just as quickly as he had come, the figure faded into the mist, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the desolate truck stop. And Mark knew, without a doubt, that David Reynolds was still out there, still searching, still waiting for help that would never come. What if your job required you to clean an office building after hours, only to realize you're not alone, and the thing sharing your space isn't human? Jake had always been a night owl, which made his job as a janitor at the Crawford Tower, in downtown Chicago, ideal. The pay was decent, and the solitude suited him. He preferred working alone, away from the noise of the daytime crowd. His shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 2 a.m., and it was always the same routine: empty the trash, vacuum the hallways, mop the floors, and lock up. The building itself was modern, sleek, with gleaming glass windows reflecting the city lights. But there was one thing about it that always unsettled Jake: the 13th floor. Unlike the other floors, which had open office spaces, the 13th floor had a different layout, with cubicles positioned in an almost maze-like pattern. Something about it always felt off. The air was colder there, the lights dimmer, and no matter how much he cleaned, it always felt like someone had just been there before him. One night, as Jake started his usual rounds, he stepped off the elevator onto the 13th floor and immediately noticed something strange. The scent of industrial cleaner and stale coffee was the same as always, but underneath it, there was something else, something metallic, like blood. Shaking off the unease, he got to work. He emptied the trash cans, wiped down the desks, and then moved to vacuum the floor. As he pushed the vacuum past a row of cubicles, a sudden noise made him stop in his tracks. Click-clack, click-clack. It was the unmistakable sound of typing. Jake turned his head toward the noise. The entire floor was supposed to be empty, but one cubicle at the far end was illuminated by the soft green glow of a desk lamp. His heart pounded as he cautiously approached, gripping the vacuum handle like a weapon. When he reached the cubicle, he froze. Sitting on the desk was an old rusted typewriter. Its keys moved on their own, striking the paper in quick succession. "Get out before it's too late." The words repeated over and over, filling the page. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His first thought was that someone was playing a prank on him. He reached forward and yanked the sheet from the typewriter, but the keys kept typing on nothing. The rhythmic clacking continued, the invisible force hammering the keys relentlessly. Then, the lights flickered. The overhead fluorescents buzzed and dimmed, plunging the office into a sickly half-darkness. The air grew even colder, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Jake swallowed hard and backed away. "All right," he muttered to himself. "I've had enough of this." He turned to leave, but the moment he did, the elevator at the end of the hall let out a soft ding. The doors slid open. Jake's stomach clenched. No one else was supposed to be here. The building was locked at night, and he was the only one on duty. And yet, someone was standing inside the elevator. A figure in a janitor's uniform. The same uniform Jake was wearing. But it wasn't just the uniform that made his blood run cold. It was the figure itself. Its face was shadowed, obscured, but its mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, too wide, too unnatural. In one hand it held a mop, dragging it slowly across the elevator floor, leaving a dark, wet streak behind. Jake's body screamed at him to move, but his feet were cemented in place. The figure took one slow step forward, then another, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. And then, in a voice that barely sounded human, it whispered, "You're in my spot." Jake stumbled backward, heart hammering, and bolted for the stairwell. He yanked open the door and leaped down the steps two at a time, lungs burning. He just had to get to the ground floor, get outside, and never come back. But something was wrong. No matter how many stairs he descended, no matter how many flights he ran down, he always ended up back on the 13th floor. The door would slam open in front of him, and he would be staring at the same cubicles, the same dim glow of the desk lamp, the same rusted typewriter, and the figure was always waiting. Each time it was closer. Jake tried again. He ran faster, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. He hurled himself through the stairwell door and landed right back where he started. This time, the figure was standing just a few feet away. The grin had stretched impossibly wide, its head twitching with small, jerky movements. It lifted the mop and dragged it across the floor, leaving another wet, dark streak. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision swam. The walls of the cubicles seemed to stretch and shift, the whole floor warping around him. He clutched his head, squeezing his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. And then, blackness. Jake woke up in the building lobby, sprawled across the cold marble floor. His uniform was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling. His head throbbed, but he was alive. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass doors. The normalcy of it all was jarring. People bustled past him, businessmen, secretaries, the day shift janitor giving him a confused look. Jake scrambled to his feet, his breath still uneven. He didn't wait. He didn't explain. He walked straight out of the building and never looked back. Later that day, he called his supervisor and quit. But the story didn't end there. Out of morbid curiosity, he started digging into the building's history. What he found chilled him to the bone. Years ago, before the building had been renovated, a janitor named Thomas Grady had worked the night shift. Just like Jake, one night, Grady suffered a fatal heart attack while mopping the 13th floor. No one found his body until the next morning. It had been slumped in the elevator, his mop still clenched in his hand, his face frozen in a silent, twisted scream. After his death, strange reports began surfacing. Employees working late complained of hearing phantom footsteps, of lights flickering on the 13th floor, even when no one was there. Some janitors even quit after claiming they had seen someone standing in the elevator late at night. a man in a janitor's uniform with a smile far too wide for his face. Jake shut his laptop and rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the lingering chill. He never spoke of what happened to him that night, but sometimes when he walked past the Crawford Tower on his way home, he swore he could see something standing just inside the lobby, watching, waiting, and smiling. If you ever find yourself alone in a dark hallway, a deserted truck stop, or an empty office building late at night, listen closely. Some shadows aren't just tricks of the light, and some visitors never truly leave. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Have a paranormal experience of your own? Let me know in the comments, or you can mail me to the address below. I just might feature it in the next video. Until next time, stay safe and keep your lights on.